Hey gang, it's your boy Platt. I'm back with a follow-up video to a follow-up video. The first video I ever made on YouTube was a video called Simplest Way to Make Booze at Home. Basically, it was just homemade wine. Some people called it prison wine. It was just a real easy way to make alcohol at home. I've received almost 600,000 views on the video. I got tons of comments and questions. I tried my best to answer all of them. And about a year and a half or so ago, I realized, well, why don't I just do a follow-up video? I think I'd been on some YouTube forums trying to learn how to hopefully make a better YouTube channel. They said, you know, doing follow-up videos or whatever was a good way to, again, help your audience and everything, and probably better explain certain things than just having to, reply to comments. So in that video, I answered probably the biggest questions I was getting at the time, which was, well, what's the ABV in this? How do we bump up the ABV? How do we make it taste better? And so, in the video called Simplest Way to Make Booze Revisited, again, I touched on those points. We made a version of the original batch, then I made another batch where we bumped up the ABV, we used bitter yeast, we had a little more sugar, what have you. And for the most part now, when I get questions along those lines, I'll refer people to that video. But lately I've gotten a couple of comments about people saying, well, we made it, we drank it, felt a little gassy, a little bloated, I got a little diarrhea. And I looked back at my comments a little bit further and realized a while back I'd gotten some similar comments. So it seems like there are some people out there that had this experience. In the past, when I'd gotten those comments, I'd ask, well, hey, did you see any mold on there? What temperature did you have it at? I'd kind of ask, well, did you leave this thing wide open? I was thinking more of, well, something must have got in there. Maybe, sanitation might have been an issue. I also asked, again, part of the crux of the original experiment was that we were going to make something as fast as possible that within a week to 10 days or whatever you could drink. And you weren't going to do any fancy winemaking techniques, and a lot of people were going to drink out of that container, which meant they might drink dead yeast. And that was another question I had. And some people say, well, I did do this or I did that, but we never really nailed it down. And again, I didn't get just a whole ton of comments like this. But it was about a few months ago that I started to realize I think I knew where the problem was. You might remember about 5-6 months back, I got a homemade winemaking kit, and I made a Pinot Noir. Now I've done plenty of beer. I've also done mead and cider and stuff, but I've never done wine in the classic sense of trying to make a Pinot Noir, a Cab, or something like that. And while I made that kit, one of the things I learned was the importance of something called degassing. Basically, you're trying to release the CO2 in there. The fermentation process is the same for wine as beer. CO2 gets created. In beer, we want that CO2 because that's what gives us a head when we pour beer. In wine, though, we really don't want it unless maybe we're making a sparkling wine, which there's a secondary fermentation in the bottle that creates that CO2. It's not CO2 from the original fermentation. So I decided to do a video and kind of cover this topic and kind of cover why we probably had this. It was probably because we didn't degas that wine. We left that CO2 in there, and people consume that CO2. Now, going back to a beer example, think about when you open a bottle of beer. Now, if you pour in a glass, you let that head develop, that CO2 is releasing, it adds to the smell, to the experience of the beer, but when you drink it, you don't get quite as gassy. But if you open a bottle of beer and you don't pour it out, and you just kind of let it sit, and you open it slow where you don't kind of cause a little foam up in the bottle, and you just start swigging straight from there, you'll notice that you kind of get bloated, a little gassy, you'll start to belch, what have you. And that's because you're consuming that CO2. That CO2 didn't get a chance to escape. And so that's what's affecting you, and I think that's what the issue is here. So we need to talk about degassing. When do we do it? Why do we do it? How do we do it? When we want to do it after fermentation's done. For one thing, we're trying to release the CO2. No need to release CO2 if we're still producing CO2. Makes sense. And that, I think, was part of the problem with the first video. We were getting ready to consume it at 7 to 10 days. A lot of times there's still fermentation going on at that point, so the yeast is still producing CO2 at the time we were consuming it. But now that we want to perfect the process, we would now wait, let our wine fully ferment, and then we could go and degas. How do you degas? Easiest way to degas is just to stir it. If I had a large 5-gallon bucket, they make these little like whisk that you put on a drill and you stir it around, or you just stir by hand. You don't want to shake it though. You don't want to, and you don't want to splash it around when you stir. Once wine's fermented, if you introduce it to oxygen or allow oxygen to get in there, that's when it turns into vinegar. And if you want to make vinegar, that's how you make vinegar. We're not wanting to turn our wine into vinegar, so we wouldn't slosh it around, but we would stir it without sloshing it, and that would release the CO2. You probably would hear it fizz like if you open a bottle of soda, what have you. And that way we're releasing that CO2. That's helping us avoid, hopefully, the bubble gut and the gassiness, the belching, what have you. Besides degassing, because there are some people concerned, well, man, if I open that fermenter, I don't want to expose it, I don't want to turn it into vinegar. Is there another way? Yes, there are a couple other ways of getting that CO2 out. One of the ways is to do a secondary fermentation. Either you can siphon off, rack off, whatever term you want to use, to transfer the liquid from the original fermentation container into a secondary fermentation container. During that process, we'll release a lot of that CO2. That will help that. Also allowing it to ferment longer. Let's say we knew 100% for sure that after 15 days our fermentation would be done. If we waited out to about 21 days, those days between days 15 and 21, we still might see the airlock or whatever you had to release the air. It might still bubble up, but it's not the CO2 being actually produced now from the yeast. It's the CO2 that was left in that solution finally releasing. So if we let it ferment out a little bit longer, we just kind of naturally let that CO2 work its way out. So those are a couple of ways. A good example of that is when I make mead. If you've ever seen my mead videos, you know that I leave in the primary for a couple of months. I may leave in secondary for 2 more months. And that is plenty enough time to let that CO2 release out. Again, the first video, the simplest way to make booze video, we were drinking within 7 to 10 days. There was still a lot of that CO2 in there. And I think that's what's getting people. Well, folks, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please leave any suggestions. If there's any more questions you want me to follow up on this topic, the simplest way to make booze, or if there's other videos that you just either have questions about or think I need to do a follow-up video on, please leave it in the comment section. And you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Till next time, bottoms up.